Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, you reopened India's mission in Afghanistan in 1990s, in 2001, 5 years after the Taliban came to power and then they were overthrown. You were ambassador again, I think, from 2010 to 2013. But in all this time, is it fair to say that the more things change, the more they remain the same in Afghanistan?
No, I wouldn't say so. Actually, I think in the last 19 years of, let's say, international support, if not to use a stronger term, uh, Afghanistan has changed a lot. I think the fundamental changes are demographic. What you have had is a very substantial explosion of a new generation that is more educated and it's quite well educated, a new generation that has grown up in a kind of multi-ethnic, democratic Afghanistan with a lot of support from the international community, including India. And this is not just a demographic change in terms of age group. It's also a kind of a mindset change, but also a kind of shift from the rural areas to the urban areas. Younger people who virtually had no role in Afghanistan in the past are beginning to play a little more role. It's questionable how much of a difference that they can make to the power structure. Women are just so much more prominent than they have been for the last almost 30, 40 years. So there are major changes. It's not the same Afghanistan.
So how do we keep that progress going?
Right. So this is what I think, that whatever we do, whatever the international community does, and whatever India does, must keep an eye to this generation of the future. I mean, we must keep in mind that this generation that has dominated until now is aging, and a lot of them will go away. Let's face it, the Afghanistan that we know today is still the Afghanistan of the old jihadi leaders. It's only with the Bonn Accord that we've had a kind of new generation coming in, still with the presence and the domineering presence of the old. Today in Afghanistan, you can't move without the patriarchs of the past.
Talking about the talks that are taking place between Special Representatives Al-Mike Khalilzad and the Taliban,
Right.
and now they've had at least some modicum of intra-Afghan. President Ghani calls
Right.
them dialogue, not talks.
Right.
The talks themselves, how do you view that? Is the US just trying to get out and it doesn't care what happens in Afghanistan?
Long and short, yes. I think the talks are ill-conceived. I don't think this is just my view. If you actually look back on the number of people who are very experienced on Afghanistan, if you look at, say, starting with the former ambassador Ryan Crocker, or if you look at, even very recently, I saw a piece by Ronald Neumann, Martin Weinbaum, who's been writing a lot about it, a number of sort of international experts. But I think more important than the international experts is actually the voice of Afghans has been largely drowned out in a kind of media, and a publicity push towards peace talks. Now, peace talks are, of course, is motherhood, and peace talks cannot be argued against. The real issue is what kind of peace. And people think when you talk about peace talks, and between who? People think that when you talk about peace talks, you're talking about two warring communities. Actually, we are talking about an established, order supported by the international community against terrorism for so many years. And on the other side, a basically terrorist movement that has made considerable military headway in Afghanistan. So in some sense, it's a war between terrorism and democracy. And you're talking about so-called a kind of, talks between that. The fundamental fact is that most of the Afghans want an end to terrorism. I mean, the primary thing is an end to terrorism. It is not just peace, a kind of repressive peace of a terrorist peace, let's call it like that.
When you're saying the Taliban have made military headway, they seem to have made a lot of diplomatic headway as well.
Correct,
And
yeah.
they seem to be, everything is on their terms, so as to speak.
Right. So I think this is where I think it is highly ill-conceived. For one, they don't take the Afghans really on board. It's not Afghan-owned, it's not Afghan-driven, it's not Afghan-controlled. So this is one sort of very serious flaw in it. The second thing is that, at least I think this is one area where India has not made a major mistake. Contacts is one thing, but the kind of diplomatic fillip if not recognition, that the so-called peace talks have given to the Taliban, this is an entirely different thing. It has almost delegitimized the government and the democratic forces at the expense of what we can call of the Taliban. And the Taliban, again, this is a debatable issue, but I think by and large the consensus is very much in view that the Taliban have not really proved that they are an independent or even a nationalistic force as they claim to be. They are very much under the tutelage of another neighboring country.
I'm just going to ask you that again. So the other major gainer in this, in the larger sense of the term from Islamabad's point of view, is Rawalpindi, is Pakistan.
Yes, and I think the latest addition of Pakistan to the kind of convergence that had taken place a little earlier, starting with the US talks, then the Moscow format, and then the Chinese were brought on board, and now of course they want to bring in Pakistan on board, highlights this. But I think one of the sort of remarkable things in this is really what has happened in the overall military and political and the diplomatic balance that we've had so far. Until now, you had the United States backing the Afghan government. Suddenly you have the United States playing a kind of a broker. I'm not going to call them an honest broker in this case, but let's say a broker in between. So what in effect has happened is that you have the US and the Afghan government on one side earlier, and you had the Taliban and Pakistan. With the US coming in between, in effect, the Afghan government and democratic forces have been left high and dry, orphaned. And in effect, you have ended up strengthening the so-called opposition, which is Pakistan and Taliban. Just in terms of a military, political, and diplomatic balance, this is the effect of the current peace talks.
But again, they seem to be in a real hurry now, because a lot of Secretary Pompeo, when he was in Kabul, said, we hope to reach a peace deal by the 1st of September.
Right.
Now that, again, September 28th is when the presidential polls have to happen. So where do you visualize whatever is happening now? What is going to emerge?
Yeah, very good point. This is a little ironic, because when President Trump announced his South Asia strategy in August 2017, the crucial point that he made in distinction to President Obama's surge and withdrawal strategy was that it would be a conditions-based strategy, not a time-based strategy. And now what we see in terms of this September 1, sort of not a deadline, but a September 1 indicative deadline, is exactly, once again, an artificial and external timeline has been introduced into political talks that by their very nature are very difficult to, determine with rigid deadlines. So what will happen is, at best, what will happen is that you might get an agreement between a set of foreign players and a set of Afghan power brokers, without the Afghan people being involved at all, which throws into question the longevity or the durability of any agreement that is reached without consensus. So personally, what I see is a situation far from a kind of end of story. What I see just is another chapter in the Afghan quagmire. What I visualize is a situation very similar to the intra-Mujahideen period, when the Mujahideen government came and then the intra-Mujahideen fighting began. In this case, it's not just going to be intra, because they're also going to be external actors, they're also going to be Taliban. And it's very difficult to see any kind of political or military stability in that situation. And God knows, at the end of that intra-Mujahideen fighting, you had the Taliban. God knows what might come out at the end of the next round of instability, if what I visualize does happen. I just don't see the elements for a stable government, even if it's a power-sharing government, even if it's a peace deal, because that peace deal could easily unravel under various kinds of tensions and frictions and pressures. And there is no, for example, what kind of guarantees will be in place even to maintain this? What kind of guarantees can we think of when at one stage you had 140,000 US troops and NATO troops and others which could not guarantee peace and stability militarily? So it's very difficult to see what kind of guarantees can be put in place as well.
But diplomatically, again, you're being very diplomatic by using the word instability. Many Afghans, maybe not openly, have told me that they fear a civil war-like situation.
I used the word instability as a euphemism for possibly the worst.
What could and can India do in this current situation?
Yeah, I think, India is among the few countries that has credibility with virtually all sections of the Afghan, both the public as well as the political forces. I think we've made a remarkable comeback from the post-Soviet days and particularly the Taliban period, when we were virtually not present there. Today, as you know, and as Afghans will tell you, that India has a place in Afghanistan regardless of our physical presence there or not. So, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but India is probably one of the few countries that has the trust of the Afghan people to be able to play a role within Afghanistan in bringing the Afghan people together. The most precious thing that the Afghans have is their unity. They cannot do much about Pakistan. They cannot do much about the Taliban. They cannot do much about US policies. These are always going to be determined by their own interests and from outside. The one thing that is there in Afghan hands is Afghan unity. And that is the one thing that we see under pressure, under strain, as a result of these so-called peace talks. And the role that India could play is, not shy away. I think so far we have been very hesitant to play a political role, not shy away from a positive political role. There is a tendency in some quarters to think a political role somehow is modeled, is like a mirror image of Pakistan. No, India's political role should not be a mirror image of either Pakistan or, for that matter, the US. So that is on the sort of internal political side. I mean, I think there's also a role that we can play on the diplomatic side. What we have seen is that the voice of the US and its allies in this entire peace process has been the dominant voice. And everybody else is more or less following. I won't say that Russia is following, but you have parallel processes. But you don't have a voice of the Afghans, or rather they are not being able to make themselves heard. The Iranians are not there. They are excluded out of every other kind of format so far. India is not there. So there is certainly a case for India, speaking up more forcefully for the so-called Afghan voice. And I shouldn't even say that even though, I should say that even though China is part of the US-Moscow kind of agreement or the statement that was made there, I don't think we should take China's position as something that is solid and solidly behind. I think they have their own interests, partly linked to Xinjiang, partly linked to geopolitics. But there is enough area there where we can actually have a conversation with the Chinese. And in fact, an opening for that was created at Wuhan. And what we did, of course, was very, very modest. But, if you look at in terms of the countries that can play an economic role in Afghanistan, then China and India come to mind and perhaps Iran come to mind as the three countries that can do the maximum in order to contribute to the economic kind of recovery of Afghanistan. We talked about, the mineral sector as one possible area. But one major development since the time that, we first took an interest in it with the Afghanistan Investment Summit in Delhi is that Afghanistan's isolation has been considerably eased. Of course, Chabahar has made some progress. In addition to that, you have, what is called the Lapis Lazuli Road, that is connectivity towards Europe through Turkmenistan. And of course, there have been some projects linked to the Chinese BRI. I don't mean the CPEC one, but also the ones through Central Asia, which will all help in connecting Afghanistan much better. So in terms of investment in the mineral sector, now there's the possibility of both evacuation as well as, downstream investments that could be considered. So there are actually several areas. If you apply your mind, one needs to look, if you look at the current situation, everything is rather, it's very deterring, it's very pessimistic. But one needs to look over the horizon and also perhaps actually start creating the conditions where people can look at these things. And the preconditions, to some extent, are much better than they used to be about 5 years back.
You're talking about a modest trilateral initiative between China, Afghanistan, and India. There was the training of diplomats, but separately in New Delhi and Beijing. But there was a view at some point of time that maybe the world, the international community, and India could use their good offices with China, especially after the Wuhan summit and spirit, to pressurize Pakistan. But that you don't visualize
I don't
happening.
see, I don't think, I think, China will pressurize Pakistan when it sees the need to pressurize
For
Pakistan. I don't
itself.
think for itself. And I don't think we should waste time and energy trying to pressurize China. China is, has its own strategic calculus. And, I think every country has their own, and I think every country's strategic calculus needs to be respected. So I don't think that is an expectation we should waste our time over. I think China will recognize those threats, and it'll make its own calculation. Maybe it feels that the better way to deal with that problem is to have Pakistan on their side.
Again, when you talk about India, whatever dispensation comes out of these talks, and if the Taliban is a major part of whatever entity you want to call it, whether it's the government or interim setup, or what should India be doing before and during that period?
See, I don't think we have a problem. Since we changed our position on the Taliban, on talks with the Taliban in 2010, I think we accept the idea that in case the Afghans and the Taliban can reach a kind of agreement, which may be even a power sharing agreement, let's say. I mean, personally, I'm pessimistic about it, but let's say a good case scenario, let's say the current peace talks reach their best results and you have a power sharing agreement tomorrow. I don't think, I mean, we have always respected what is the existing government, provided it has internal legitimacy, and I think that is something that we would like to see.
But would the Taliban want to engage with India at that position?
I would personally say that so long they are not forcibly prevented by Pakistan from engaging with India, Taliban will engage with India. And again, if you see, look a little more closely, Taliban hasn't not criticized us very much. And to be very frank, we have also not criticized the Taliban very much.
Some instances when the
there have been
choppers were
specific-
given, there was a statement.
There may have been. But let's say even when we signed the strategic partnership agreement, there was no very strong Taliban voice, even though we suspect that there were efforts to make them speak out against it. So I think the Taliban, Taliban, if at all, they are rooted in the Afghan public, which is a question that I'm putting. They cannot ignore public sentiment towards India. And unless they're completely taken by an extreme jihadi sentiment, which looks at the world in terms of, Muslims and non-Muslims, but let's not forget that there is a sentiment in Afghanistan which is very strongly in favor of the historical relationship with India. And India plays a big part in Afghanistan's historical imagination. So if you count all that, I mean, I think there will be a lot of room for dialogue. And in fact, there have been occasions we have seen where the Taliban have sometimes wondered why India is keeping them at a distance. So that itself is a sign that they would like. But we should not forget that they are under tutelage and that their room for maneuver may be restricted.
Pakistan, President Ghani has gone and visited second time. First time when he came to power in 2014, he immediately went, but then there was that whole cold shoulder between the two countries because of the involvement of Pakistan. Imran Khan is going to the White House with his generals as well. Where do you see that panning out? And also on the...
See, unless there are genuine changes, the same problems will always be there. Yeah. So the same problems will
the Americans
reassert
won't be
themselves.
pressurizing them any more on that front.
What the Americans want right now is a deal to be able to say that they get out. To be able to do the deal, they cannot limit it only to withdrawal of troops and guarantees against terrorism. So they need some kind of intra-Afghan process started. Ideally, they probably need also a ceasefire process. So far, we have not seen anything like a ceasefire. In fact, if anything, violence and including violence against children has grown even while they have been talking. So there's some movement on the intra-Afghan talks, but let's be very clear, those were very exploratory talks. That was an opportunity for the two sides to hear each other. And I think it has been successful from that point of view. But to put too much hope from there to leading to a peace deal by September 1, I would be a little surprised.
And even though President Ghani has made the right noises after he went to Islamabad, and I think he went to Lahore as well, the attack in Kandahar, the NDS has come out with a statement saying it was managed from Chaman in Pakistan, and there were constant communication happening between them. So that doesn't seem to have changed at all on the ground.
Right. I think the fact that opposition leaders and then President Ghani himself have gone to Pakistan are just proof how much Pakistan is behind it and how much the Afghans feel forced or obliged to run to the Pakistanis to ask them to control the levels of violence. I think it actually just is a testimony to Pakistani involvement in some way or the other in either the violence or in being able to control the violence. I think it is understandable that Pakistani political forces make that effort, especially when they don't seem to have alternatives from the international community. When the international community has abandoned them, then what options have they left? So I think the real issue is, what hope can the international community give the democratic forces in Afghanistan?
The democratic forces now, since again you said it's not really a deadline, but it's an indicative deadline, September 1st. President Ghani insists that talks or no talks, result or no result of those talks, 28 the presidential polls will go on.
Right.
He's also gone on record to say if there are any talks between intra-Afghan talks with the government or not, who's going to be involved, it's going to be a long drawn-out process. So where do you see the poll process going?
So, I don't think when the government of India talks about elections or about the legitimacy of the government and the constitutional process being respected, it is necessarily taking any sides between Afghan political parties. What it is saying is that elections are the best mechanism to be able to judge the political mandate. And what we are saying is that we are not necessarily saying that the government is the only democratic political force, that there are democratic political forces. Now, if you were to ask me as a former ambassador, there could be no better test of the government's legitimacy, or for that matter, any kind of peace solution or peace platform than elections. Instead of a deal being made between power brokers, what I would have visualized is that the election was an opportunity for different political parties and candidates to take their visions of a peace process to the public and have an election more or less, this being the single biggest agenda for the election. Because
and for the US and the international community to make sure that those
because
are free and fair elections.
Exactly. In fact, we should have probably, we meaning the international community, should have put as much of its energy in as possible into ensuring that there is a free and fair election, so that the opposition parties are also reassured that the outcome will be a fair outcome. Now, if such a process had been followed, rather than this artificial deadline to have a peace agreement based on sort of obviously external interests, then whatever the outcome would have had a basis in the people, and that itself could have become a much stronger basis for negotiations with the Taliban. Because at least when you negotiate with the Taliban, now you know that the people have voted for this or that peace platform. So I think this is an opportunity that has been missed. And I think President Ghani is also right in another respect, because if you do not go through this process, then you run the risk of a constitutional vacuum. Then everything, that means the whole Bonn Accord, 19 years of peace or relative peace that we've had, at least a new generation that has come into power, all that will be thrown, baby with the bathwater. And once again, you have a situation of a Hobbesian state of affairs where every interested party, and God knows Afghanistan has enough fault lines, political, ethnic, many other fault lines, religious fault lines, and all these could come into place. But also for the fact that it is the fundamental basis for the political order today, and minus the elections, minus in other words, if there is a constitutional vacuum, then frankly it's a free for all sides are for themselves, and then I think all the nightmare scenarios that we talked about will virtually come into play. Because what is holding the place together? Will just an agreement among some external players and some internal players be sufficient to provide the consensus for a future Afghanistan? If that is the case, what was the purpose and use of the bond, and then subsequently the 2000 negotiations for the 2004 constitution, the constitutional Loya Jirga, and the entire political process, which, by the way, was quite a broad-based political process. And let's not forget one thing: through all this political, let's call it, rivalry that we have seen in the last year or so, nobody has questioned the 2004 constitution, and nobody has questioned that the gains of the last 19 years, and nobody is prepared to lose the gains of the last 19 years. We are talking about reconciliation and peace based on those advances, which include everything. I don't need to specifically mention women's rights or youth empowerment and women's empowerment and so on. So I think, the kind of future stability of Afghanistan is based on that. Now, whether or not you can reconcile the idea of an Islamic Republic, whether with an Islamic emirate, whether the Taliban will accept even the outcome of an elections, which after all is contrary to the whole idea of the emirate. I mean, these are very open questions. I think that's why I think it is unrealistic to expect agreements, and that too under pressure from outside in such short times. Political agreements are not reached so easily. And whatever power brokers may decide, the public will still count, and individual leaders will count, and political forces will count. And the post-2001 generation may not be a powerful political voice right now, or at least they may not have translated that into conventional currencies of power, like military force. But don't expect them to just remain quiet and die out.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Pleasure.